Hello, welcome to the Hidden Gifts of Loss podcast. Today on my show, I have Phyllis Unterschuetz, and she can correct me if I said that wrong. She is a writer just outside of Atlanta, and she has briefly shared her story with me. And this was a story that she kept hidden for many years, and that was a very difficult thing for her to deal with, and the grief that she went through and how that has transformed her is what she is going to share with me today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your story, Phyllis. I will let you jump right in. And I just really want to thank you for being here today and for being vulnerable.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. So grateful that you invited me to be on your podcast. It's a wonderful podcast. I've listened to several of your episodes, and I'm quite in favor of anybody who creates a space for people to tell their stories.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an
Yes.
honor.
Well, I don't know. I was going to say I'll start at the beginning, and I can't really understand where the beginning is most of the time. But I think probably where the story starts in full is that when I was 21, I went to France, and I actually went out to do service for my religious community, which was a big part of the backstory of all of this. And I'm a member of the Baha'i religion. And so I had gone as a Baha'i to do a year of service. And I grew up pretty sheltered, actually. And when I got to France, all of a sudden, everybody was having sex. And I was utterly unprepared for that environment. So I ended up having sex with folk and getting pregnant and just hit this wall where I realized if I have this baby, everybody's going to know what I was doing when I was supposed to be here as a religious person. And I was doing these things that in my mind were not religious. And everybody's going to know, and I'm going to bring shame on myself and on my family and on my religious community, and I can't do it. I was alone. My family was all back in the States. I didn't really have any close friends there. And I just panicked, I think. And I just said, okay, I can't do this. And so I had an abortion. It was illegal at the time. I had to go to Switzerland. And in the middle of the night, up the back stairs. So the whole thing was, I don't want to talk too much about the actual procedure, but it was quite traumatic. And the following day, I went and I sat on a bench at the foot of Lake Zurich. And I said, you know what? This never happened. This never happened. The child, the person who got pregnant, I don't want you in my life. You're gone. Mm. And I just went into this deep denial. So there was no grieving. And I think I've thought back about it. And I think the reason I didn't think I had the right to grieve because I felt like I'm the one that did that. I had the abortion. So how can I grieve the loss of my child? It's my own fault. So I didn't feel like I had permission to grieve. And that was part of it, that lack of permission and the shame. The shame was just debilitating. And so I just shut it all out, tried to pretend it didn't happen. And came back to the States, met my husband that I've been married to for 54 years now, or 53 years. And got pregnant shortly thereafter. My oldest daughter was born. I just had this life. It's a fine life. Yeah. Except that things kept happening to trigger the memory. Yeah. The thing about these memories, if you don't own them and process them, and if you don't process the trauma and the grief, it just keeps coming up again. Yeah. And here I tried eating it away. I gained massive amounts of weight and I just couldn't make it go away. So over the years, I tried having therapy. I had therapy with one therapist who said, you need to acknowledge that this child existed and you need to say goodbye. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, if that's what I have to do to get rid of this. I had a lot of anger and I couldn't figure out what am I angry about? Where is this anger coming from? And so I did a little ceremony with her. I brought a doll, wrote a letter to the baby, and I said, I'm so sorry. goodbye. And I had a memorial service, actually, and I invited a few of my very closest friends. So I did at that point, I told my husband and 4 other people. But it was all about saying goodbye. And I thought, okay, now I'm fine.
Yeah.
Of course, I wasn't. It just, and the whole book is about these things that happened that just when I thought I had things under control, something else would remind me and I would fall apart. And so at one point after, I don't want to give the whole book away, but at one point after a pretty traumatic experience, I saw a billboard that said God hates murderers and had a picture of an aborted fetus. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to hell and I don't even believe in hell. I'm going to get to the next world and I'm going to be cut off from all love. I was telling myself some pretty horrendous stories that don't actually come from my religious teachings. They came from somewhere else. And I finally got with a therapist who said, why do you want to say goodbye to this child? You don't say goodbye to other people you lose who have died. You stay connected to them. And that was what turned everything around. I'm like, wait, I can have a relationship
Wow.
with the soul of this child.
She gave you permission.
Yes.
That's
And
what you needed.
I went through quite a bit of therapy with her, and it wasn't finished at that point. That was back in 2000, but things started to open up. And then I told my children. And my oldest daughter, she said, I always wanted an older brother, and I always imagined that I might have an older brother somewhere. Now you're telling me that I actually do. And so she embraced him immediately. And I had given him a name by then, this child, and I gave him the name Ruhi, which means light. And family embraced him. I started telling friends, and things would still happen, right, to bring this grief up. And so when I do want you to jump in and ask questions because I'll just keep talking for an hour.
I'm just enthralled.
When I had a really close friend that he was really my son's friend, and I had formed a friendship with him. And I'd only known him for less than 2 years, but we had some really beautiful spiritual conversations. And he died in 2005. And I wailed, I cried, and I cried. And for months after he died, I would cry. And I'm like, what the heck? I barely knew this guy. And it wasn't until I started writing my memoir that I realized, oh, that was a little opening into that reservoir of unexpressed grief.
He could have been your son spiritually. Was he around the same age?
He was around the same age. And I think even more than that, I think that was probably really important. But also, it was like I had permission to grieve his death. Everybody was grieving his death. Everyone loved him. He was everybody's best friend. So grieving his death I felt like I had permission to do that. I didn't feel like I had permission to grieve the death of my child because I caused it.
Because our society doesn't give permission. Yeah. There's so much controversy around that. It's not seen as a loss. It's seen as something that you did.
Yeah. And I don't want to try to pretend that isn't true. That's not what happened. I don't want to be in denial about that I made.
But it's a loss.
It is a terrible loss. What I realized when I started writing my book, but that the even greater loss was the loss of myself, that I exiled part of myself, the part who was guilty in my eyes, so that I could still be seen as somebody who wouldn't do something like that. And because I went through my life with her looking at me in through the window instead of a part of my life, I think that probably diminishes what we're able to offer in service if we're not bringing our whole selves. And also the fact that I kept it from my children for so long. When the kids are growing up and they're teenagers and they're struggling with things. And I think I could have been a more supportive mother to them if they had known what I went through. But at that point, I was still ashamed to tell. I thought they would shun me if they knew what I had done.
Wow. Yeah, that's all you could. That was what you had to cope with at that time without support and being alone and in a different country. And you didn't feel like you could tell anybody.
Yeah.
Just to cut that whole part off is also, yeah, a huge loss. And it seems like you've been able to reunify
I
all
have.
yourself.
What I think is that Ruhi helped me. I think that I realized I wanted this connection with the soul of my child. And because of that connection, I felt like I had the courage then to reconnect with my young self because she was the one carrying the memories. And I had really suppressed those memories. And when I started doing the work, mainly through my writing and with a therapist, I got another therapist, there was a lot of memories that came up that were really hard and really painful. And I think one of the things that was different now than from back in 1970, I think when I was sitting on that bench at the foot of Lake Zurich, and I think I said, I'm not going to be able to hold these memories. They're too painful and frightening. And I don't have the capacity to manage them. And now, yes, of course I have the capacity to manage them. Yes, they're hard and painful. But I think it was really my connection with Ruhi that helped me get to that point. It was almost like he was saying to me, yeah, you're not done yet. You have this other thing you need to do. You need to tell our story because it's his story as well.
Mhm.
But you need to heal with yourself first because she's got a lot of wisdom in the memories and you're not a whole person. So, of all of the gifts that this journey of loss and rediscovery and disconnection and reconnection has brought, the most, I think the most wonderful one, the one I'm most grateful for, it's a dual one, the connection with the soul of my child and the connection with my own young self.
Yeah.
Now I feel like, okay, I'm shored up. I've got the support. I've got so much support from my family and my writing friends and everybody. People I tell are like, oh my God, that's such an important story. You need to get that out there to help other people deal.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I was just going to say too. It's so important. This is something that I feel like even still, and even with everything that's going on politically, it just doesn't get talked about. And so many women have been through this. I went through this when I was 19.
Did you really?
I
Okay.
did. I did. Yeah. I got pregnant when I was 19 and the boy I was engaged to, but that just didn't fit in with his view of his life. He was going to go to medical school, which he did, and is an amazing surgeon. I'm not in contact with him except on Facebook, but yeah, it was, I had support. Fortunately, I had my family. My parents were supportive. The boy was not supportive when we broke up after that because I couldn't get over it. And he was like, I'm not going to marry you. And now that you're this depressed person and how so I feel like I feel like what you went through, the completely cutting yourself off and the shame, I felt guilty, but I didn't have a religious kind of you're going to hell kind of thing. I had more of a fear of karma that, well, you aren't going to get to have any more children because you did this.
I had the same thing. And in fact, when I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, I have Rh negative blood, which I did not know. And this is actually a chapter I was just working on in the book by my obstetrician saying, were you ever pregnant before? Because you have negative blood and your husband is positive. And so the baby you're carrying is positive. And if you were pregnant before, and particularly if you had an abortion, a medical abortion before, or a surgical abortion before, this baby is at risk. And so that was that karma thing. I'm like, okay, God's going to punish me for having an abortion by taking away this child. And the thing is, like I said, I mentioned I'm a member of the Baha'i faith, and none of those teachings are in my religion. That was stuff I got from previous things that I had heard, maybe in the church or I don't know. And the whole thing about being pregnant when you weren't married. When I was in high school, I graduated in 1967. There were girls who just suddenly disappeared and we never saw them again. I remember one whose name was in the graduation ceremony. Her name was in the program, but she wasn't there because we found out later she'd gotten pregnant, was shipped away. So there was this shame, and it was connected with religion, of course, because you're talking about a potential human being. And I think you mentioned the politics. This is one of the things I hope to do with my book, is to use it to create a shame-free space where women who have perhaps differing opinions about abortion can come together and tell their stories. Because how many of us are either extreme pro-life or extreme pro-choice, where most women are both? In my experience. I want a growing baby's life to be protected whenever that's possible. But sometimes it isn't possible. And that is a choice that the woman makes with her doctor, her spiritual advisor, her family. It's too complicated a choice.
Yeah, and it's too personal. There's too many circumstances and things that need to be factored in. It's not black and white. It's not, but it shouldn't be decided politically and using religion to fuel that. It's and then you think about those women that were sent away in shame back then. Is the boy ever talked about? Is the miracle of birth and the power that we have as women celebrated? No, it was just swept away under the rug. What is that? What is that like error in thinking?
We're not going to talk about it.
We're not going to talk about it. Oh my God, they had sex. Of course they did. You're in your 20s and that's just what happened. Then it's not like you can't do that whole, let's just, you said you were unprepared.
I was completely unprepared. And I think unprepared. I was unprepared in one sense that I grew up in a very sheltered kind of way. Like I said, these girls just disappeared. You had sex education, maybe in junior high. I don't know. But you just didn't talk about it. Our parents didn't talk about it.
Where do you learn?
I do have a memory that just pops up every so often of my dad. He liked to build things, and he was up in my room building a desk that was attached to the wall with these slanted legs, and I was handing him the tools and the screwdrivers and stuff, and he said, "I think it's time we have a talk." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." And he has a screwdriver, no, a nut and a bolt. That's what it was. He had a nut and a bolt, and he said, "Okay, here's like the woman, and here's like the man." I'm like, "Dad, stop." But that was the extent.
He tried, but that was the nuts and bolts of it.
Nuts and bolts of it. But the thing is, we didn't have any place to really talk about it with somebody who could counsel us. Why? And so I was very unprepared. I didn't know anything about setting boundaries. It wasn't even a concept. And in fact, the therapist I went to, the one who said, "Why say goodbye to this child? Let's form a connection." She started out one day and she said, "Okay, I think we should talk about boundaries." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Oh dear." So I didn't know anything about that. But there's another layer that's very interesting to me that I'll probably explore more in my next book, because I was very overweight all my life, really. I've struggled with that. And I was heavy as a child and as a teenager. And so I did not fit into the category of the desirable girls. And that's where value was. That's where value was given or withheld. If you were desirable to boys, then that made you valuable, right? And so I never experienced that until I got to France. And then all of a sudden I was desirable to everybody. And I did not know how to navigate that. I liked it.
Yeah, but how would you didn't have a framework for that at all?
So there's so many layers of social conditioning that come up. Here's what I've learned about memoir. You can't put it all in one book.
Absolutely so true.
You may want to, but
you can't.
Wow, but was definitely part of it. The weight, my whole sense of, was I attractive or was I not? And so when I left France, and I left in my mind, I left the baby and the guilty self in Switzerland or in France or wherever they were. And I went back to the States to my normal life. Of course, I didn't leave them.
No.
Came with me.
Of course.
Came with me and kept wanting to be known. They wanted to be known and wanted to hide them.
And so you think about the food and overweight, protection, and being hidden and not being seen by the society, by the patriarchy, and fitting the patriarchy's definition of beauty. It makes so much sense.
Plus, food is a very, very effective self-soothing device.
Yes.
Especially when using that since you were little, very little. So I just fell into that. And
yeah, absolutely. I absolutely relate. And I did the same thing with food my whole life. That shame that internalized shame that we get from society, like you said, those ideas weren't even really in your religion per se, but these were things that you just absorbed from the society. And I struggled with my weight, honestly, until this year. I lost 40 pounds. But before that, I always struggled with my weight.
wow.
And not that I'm necessarily plugging the Shift Weight Mastery, but that's what I did. This woman, Rita Black, and she uses hypnosis and meditation. And
interesting.
The only thing that ever worked. And I still can't believe it. I look in the mirror and I'm like, really? It was the missing piece, was whatever was going on in the subconscious. She had this way of reprogramming with just suggestions of different ways to think. That
these are neural pathways, right?
Yes.
That have been reinforced and reinforced. I know that I get impatient sometimes with programs that are focused on, okay, you're having some intense feeling right now, so you have to eat. I'm not having an intense feeling. I'm watching Star Trek. I'm fine. I'm happy. Why this urge that feels impossible to ignore? Like, and why, if I ignore this urge to eat? It's not about a horrible emotion right then. It's about a reinforced neural pathway. And
you hit the nail on the head. It's that it feels irresistible to eat, like you have to do it. And that's what she disrupts, which is just amazing. Yeah.
Say it again. What's the name of
It's the Shift Weight Mastery. I was on her podcast. Her podcast is called the Thin Thinking Podcast. And she lost 40 pounds 22 years ago and kept it off, and then became a hypnotist and has helped thousands of people end the weight struggle. She calls it weight release, which I love, because she said if you lose something, maybe you're going to go looking for it. But if you release it, just like releasing grief, right? You released it. You don't need it anymore.
That's interesting. I was so miserable, and I had weight loss surgery.
Oh,
early kind that they called it a stomach staple. It was a ring.
I remember that.
Yeah. And so I'm actually considered a success with that because I lost probably about 80 pounds and kept that off. But then I had to have it reversed because I built up so much scar tissue around the ring that I couldn't eat anything. I could only,
God.
So I had to have it reversed. And this is a whole nother story, but it was the surgeon. The surgeon who did the reversal was the son of the surgeon who did the original stomach staple.
Whoa.
Funny, he kept saying, oh, my dad did good work here. Look at it. But he told me before he did it, he said, I'm nervous about doing this surgery because I'm afraid you'll gain those 80 pounds back. I'm like, no, that's not going to happen. So fortunately, that didn't happen, but it's still an issue. It's just because it's about more than the actual poundage. The actual fat on your body is only part of the problem. It's a problem, but it's only part of the problem.
Yeah, just a manifestation, of what's going on, and except that it's visible, right? It does all come out of those things, that unprocessed grief, those things that we hold on to. Like you said, maybe you're not having that feeling in the moment, but it got started somewhere, and then those neural pathways are solidified
and reinforced. Yeah. I actually just got an official eating disorder diagnosis last year at age 74, maybe before I turned 75. And Yeah, that was bizarre. I'm like, yeah, I know. And it was interesting to have a diagnosis, have a name.
Yeah, I had an eating disorder when I was younger, and my best friend had an eating disorder. She was up and down the scale. She was in and out of hospitals. She had an abortion too. So many of my friends have had that. And I really think it's so important that you're writing. What's your book called?
The working title is This Never Happened.
Um, that's
But
perfect.
it can change.
Oh, of course.
It can still change for many reasons. But
Yeah.
because I'm still working on it. I've got my rough draft has been done for a while, actually. And so now I'm probably in my third or fourth round of revisions and trying to cut out the stuff that is unnecessary and figure out how to organize the things that are necessary. Sometimes I have to take breaks, but the thing that's interesting is that when I started writing, I started playing around with it in 2021, but not really. I talked to some folks and they said, no, you got to write this book. But it was in 2022 that I really started writing, and I actually worked with a memoir writing coach and started to
That Allison?
Yeah, with
Yeah,
Allison.
that's how we connected through Memoir Writing Inc. with Allison Waring. Yeah.
Okay. And I had already published a book. I had a book published. My husband and I co-authored a book that was published by Baha'i Publishing Company. And that was a story of we lived in an RV for 15 years, and we traveled around the country, and we were really doing field research around racial conditioning, how white people are conditioned to understand race, and particularly the relationship between Black and white Americans is area of focus. We wrote a book that is a collection of true stories about our time on the road and what we learned about ourselves as white people and how we'd been indoctrinated and brainwashed, how that brainwashing was determining how we behaved, which was infuriating. We had to reprogram ourselves. We had to rewrite the stories that were going through our heads. So that's
Fascinating. That book called?
It's called Longing, Stories of Racial Healing.
I got to read that.
So that was
both your book.
Published in 2010. So I already, I understood quite a bit about writing a book and getting a book published. The difference was that the publishing company came to us. Because we're Baha'is, the Baha'i religion is still fairly young, and the publishing trust knew what we were doing. And they came to us and they said, we want to publish this book. So we didn't have to go through this, what I'm sure is going to be a difficult process of finding an agent and a publisher and everything. And then we just worked on it. We had an editor that worked with us. But I didn't understand what memoir really was, and the craft of writing memoir was something that I hadn't dealt with. So going through Allison's class, I'm like, oh, okay, there's more to this than just putting the story down. And I love language and I love writing, and I've been writing most of my life, but there's more to it than that. The craft of putting a book together.
Yeah, there is. There's so much more, and it's so much more work than you think it's going to be.
My lordy, it sure is.
And all the revisions and the cutting is hard. I know when I found Allison, it was 2021. We may have gone through it around the same time. It was a year after my mom had died, and in the middle of the pandemic, January 2020, she got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And that experience was just absolutely life-altering, going through that, and then losing my dad the very next year too. And I've always journaled and I've always written. So I journaled my way through it, right? That was my sanity. And then I thought, I need to write this story. And several people said, you really need to write this story. The setting of the pandemic in the background and everything. Yeah. And when I found Allison, it was like a light went on. And I'm like, oh, memoir is what I'm writing. I didn't even realize that was my genre. And then it all makes sense. But yeah, I'm still working on it. And I have an idea I want to take, and why I ask people to sign a release form is because I would like to turn these podcast stories into an anthology book.
Oh, that's perfect.
So yeah, that'll either be book 1 or book 2. I think that one will actually be a little easier than the memoir, but The memoir is in progress and has been, and it will be done. But yeah, it's like you said, sometimes you have to take breaks, and it's a labor of love, right? Especially, it's almost like it's a love letter to your son, it sounds like.
It very much is. What's interesting is that I have a writing group now. I'm working with another writing coach. Her name's Kim Douglas. Write to Unite is her program. And I actually reached out to her specifically because she's a member of my Baha'i religion. And I thought I could really use the guidance of a writing teacher because she taught writing at college level for decades. So she knows what she's doing, but she also understands this spiritual framework and the religious layer that lies over the whole thing. Because my religious teachings are very clear about you don't end the life of a developing child just for convenience sake.
Mhm.
Sometimes there are times when it has to happen for other reasons. So it's not like the Baha'i faith says, oh, yes, go out and have an abortion. It, like all religions, it says life is sacred.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it doesn't say you're damned if you do it and you should be shamed and cut off and called a murderer. Well,
Exactly.
so I'm wandering off the point. But because Kim was a member of the Baha'i religion, I thought, okay, she can really help me figure out how to frame this aspect of the story. So that's been really valuable for me because that's something I want to do that well in a way that people are not turned off by the idea of religion being part of this book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Your story. It is part of it. It can't not be part of it.
Can't not be part of it. And it was the same thing with the book that my husband and I wrote. Stories that we wrote were very much about our Baha'i teachings, our religious beliefs, because that's why we went on the road to begin with. And the teachings about unity and the elimination of racial prejudice, that was undergirding everything we did. But we didn't want to write a book about religion. We wanted to write a book about white people coming to grips with their own internalized beliefs about race.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because we were very vulnerable in that book. We really laid bare, okay, I have this white privilege and I have these white supremacist teachings bouncing around in my head. And how do I relate to people? How do I relate to Black folks without constantly making a fool of myself? You don't. You just make a fool of yourself and then repair. And so I've had people say, you were so vulnerable and brave and courageous to write that book. Maybe that must be helping you with the book you're writing now. Yes, it is. And no, it isn't.
Exactly. They're very different topics. And how, yeah, I don't know if I can articulate it, but yeah,
It was
it helps and it
articulated
does.
very well by a woman I met at a writing retreat. And I was telling her kind of this same thing, how, okay, that story and this story, and how do I look at the overlap and how they're different. And she said, from what we hadn't been talking very long, but she was clearly very astute, this woman. Because she said, from what you've been telling me, the thing you had going for you in your first book is that you were on your own side. Because your religious teachings talked about what white people need to do to self-assess, to take account, be accountable for who we are and how we've been raised in this country. So you were doing what your teachings told you to do. And you, even though you were vulnerable, you were on your own side. And she said, it sounds like for this new story, you were not on your own side for a long time. And you're just now learning how to be your own advocate. And so she said, yeah, that takes a lot more courage and persistence and deep diving.
Yeah, I think your book's going to be really helpful to a lot of people. I know I definitely want to read it. It's just we need to have those conversations. And and when there's so much shame and controversy around an issue that you almost feel like you can't, well, we're still being silenced. And
yes, thank you for saying that. It is true. We are being silenced. We are being, first of all, we're being pitted against each other politically, which is a tactic to keep people from uniting and coming up with solutions that might change the status quo that people benefiting from the status quo don't want to change. So keep people pitted against each other so they can't come. And that's what the partisan politics around abortion is doing, that very effectively. But then also the shame, when you layer the shame on top of that, it's, yeah, exactly. We're being silenced again. And we're being disempowered by that shaming and that silencing. And there's no reason that we can't reclaim our power. And through our stories.
Yes. Use our voices, right? That's, yeah, powerful, really powerful. Wow. Ah, I feel like we could just talk for hours and have a good conversation. I'm really excited to read your book. Yeah, you have to let me know when it comes out. I entered the Amy Award, which I also had wanted to do.
Me
That
too.
first piece into 2,000 words was a good exercise.
I think I submitted like 15 minutes before the deadline or something. It was interesting. Last year I sent in basically it was an excerpt from my book that I had rewritten enough that it was a standalone piece. And it was a very crucial scene. I got the notification that it was longlisted. I didn't really want that scene to be publicized. And I hadn't thought of that at all. And I'm like, oh no. Oh, please don't let it get shortlisted, because I didn't want it to be out in public. It was too soon. And so it was so odd, because I was so relieved when it didn't go farther. And I thought, that's the only time in my life that'll ever happen. That's so funny. This year I submitted something completely unrelated. I could write an entire book over the coincidences. There's
Exactly. Yeah.
mysterious.
They are. Yeah. Yeah. Tell me about that little coincidence.
So one of the most really bizarre coincidences that happened after I'd been writing for a while. So trying to set this all up. So when I lived in France, I had gone to these summer schools, French and Swiss summer schools. And I helped out with the children's program, and I met some youth and all that. And I met this lovely family from London, this Baha'i family. And the father was from the islands somewhere. I can't quite remember which of the Caribbean islands he was from. Very dark skinned. The mother was British and very pale skinned. And they had 5 children that were like all different colors and different features and everything. It was this beautiful family. And I was the children's class teacher. And so their kids were in my class. And I had a few photographs. And decades later, I'm writing this book. And I had come on Facebook and found one of the children, who was now a grown man living in Australia with his family. And I said, do you remember that thing we went to and I was your teacher? And he said, yeah, I do remember that. And I said, this is all on Facebook, right? I said, somewhere I have photos of you when you were a child and I was your teacher, but I don't know where the photos are. They're buried somewhere. And he said, wait, if you ever find them, let me know. A long time goes by. And I dig the photos out from where they were buried in my closet. I don't know how long went by, maybe a year or more. And I had the photo of us at this Baha'i summer school in Switzerland, and it was sitting in my hand, actually. I set it down and I thought, oh, let me just go on Facebook. I go on Facebook and I have a message from an unknown person, somebody I have no idea who she is, but she's a friend of the guy in Australia. And she writes on the bottom of my Facebook message from however long ago it was, if you ever find that picture, please post it online, because I was there too and I'd love to see it. And I'm like, what? The timing is too strange.
Yes.
There's so many things. There were so many.
And those are definitely the hidden gifts. Yeah. Wow. And that like a piece of you too that you went back to. And I like the idea that, yeah, there you were this teacher. You were teaching these children. You were not this bad person that you had to exile. And then that's interesting with that all coming back together and that memory coming back.
Yes, yeah. Because when you try to go through your life with a part of yourself cut off, you're just not coming with your full gifts. You're not bringing your full gifts to the table.
Yeah.
But the process of healing with your own self is hard.
It is hard. You have to forgive yourself.
Forgive yourself. like I had to, and here's something else that I realized as a result of writing, the writing that brings these things up, right? Not only did I have to forgive, did my like adult self have to forgive my young self, but she had to forgive me for pushing her out. I had asked for forgiveness for cutting her off and sending her away. And that was a very intense encounter.
Oh, that's deep.
Such amazing things, though. In the memoir group I'm in now, one of the women in there, we share pages, right? And so they're reading my story as I write it and giving me feedback. And she'll say, I love Ruhi. I just love Ruhi. He's taught me so many things. And I'm like, wow, this child that I tried to keep secret from the world is having an impact on this person that I barely know. And as a result, her sisters and mother shared an abortion story that they had kept secret for decades because she related to them my story. So this is how this works. If we tell our stories, they have their own life, right? These stories, and they launch out into the world and they help whoever they're going to help.
Your book has its own life, and you know what? Maybe we need to do an abortion anthology, right?
This is something that keeps
Or
coming. Yeah. In fact, I belong to an post-abortion support group. They meet tonight, actually. And these women are telling their stories and they know I'm a writer, and this keeps coming up. You need to write other women's stories too. I'm like, let me finish my book first.
Yeah. Maybe this is one of those coincidences. There's, in quote, there are no coincidences, right? So it's meant to be. Wow.
Mm.
I mean, we know there's a lot of women that could tell that story. This has been just amazing. I'm so happy we did this, and I'm so happy I got to meet you. And I just feel like we're kindred spirits.
And it's been sweet and so uplifting.
Yes.
I appreciate you and what you're doing with your podcast so much.
Thank you.